The plane had just taken off from New York City, and the soft hum of the engines created a low, steady rhythm in the background. The flight was expected to be a long one, but nothing out of the ordinary for the passengers who were settling in for the next few hours. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, performing their duties with practiced ease as the passengers adjusted their seats and prepared for the journey ahead. Joanne was one of the flight attendants on this morning flight. She had been working for over 15 years with the airline, and she had seen it all, from the quiet businessmen to the loud families, and even the occasional celebrity. But today was different. There was something about this particular flight, something in the air that she couldn't quite place. As Joanne made her way through the first-class cabin, she noticed him immediately sitting there in seat 1A. Was a man who looked as if he didn't belong among the rich and famous. He had a calm demeanor and wore simple clothes, a black hoodie and jeans, yet something about him stood out even more because of his understated nature. The passengers around him whispered quietly, trying to make sense of the man who looked so familiar, but didn't quite match the usual celebrity glitz they were used to. It wasn't long before Joanne realized who he was, despite his casual appearance. The moment she recognized him, her heart skipped a beat. It was Keanu Reeves, the famous actor known for his iconic roles in movies that had defined generations. She had seen him in person before, during a brief encounter at the airport once, but seeing him here now in such an ordinary setting felt surreal. Joanne wasn't the type to get starstruck. She had met plenty of celebrities during her time as a flight attendant and treated them just like any other passenger. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the way Keanu seemed so unbothered by his surroundings, or perhaps it was the quiet energy he carried that made him seem even more enigmatic. She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on her job, but when she got to his seat with the beverage cart, she hesitated for just a moment, not wanting to seem flustered or out of place. "What can I get you today, sir?" She asked, her voice a little colder than she intended, as she glanced at him for the first time. Keanu looked up from his seat, his dark eyes meeting hers, his expression warm but reserved. He smiled just slightly and said in a voice that seemed to carry an unspoken calm, "I'll have a water, please." His tone was polite, simple even, but it was his eyes that held Joanne's attention. They were kind yet piercing, almost as if he could read her thoughts. Joanne nodded and started to move on to the next passenger, but for some reason she paused. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders, and without fully realizing it, she turned back to him and said, "I'll get to you in just a moment." Her words were sharp, almost dismissive, and she immediately regretted them, but she had already said it, and there was no turning back now. Keanu didn't seem bothered by her response. In fact, he didn't even flinch. His eyes remained steady as he nodded slightly and leaned back in his seat, as if he was simply waiting for her to do what she had to do. The passengers around him noticed the exchange, and some of them cast glances toward Joanne, wondering if she had simply made a mistake or if something more was at play. But Joanne was already moving on down the aisle, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had begun to creep into her chest. She knew she had acted coldly, but she had been working under a lot of pressure and didn't have time for idle chit-chat with any passenger, much less a celebrity. As she served the other passengers, she could feel the tension building inside her, like a knot tightening with every step. She took each glance she threw toward Keanu only seemed to amplify the unease. She felt, she told herself, it was nothing, that it was just another flight, but deep down something was different about this moment, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it would come back to haunt her. As the flight continued on its steady course through the skies, Joanne couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The uneasy knot in her chest tightened with every passing minute. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to that one moment when she had so sharply dismissed Keanu's simple request. She could still hear the coolness in her voice, the way she had walked away, as though he didn't matter when clearly he did. The other passengers were settling in. Some of them were reading newspapers, others were watching movies, or chatting quietly with the people sitting next to them. The usual hum of the plane filled the background, but all Joanne could think about was the man sitting quietly in seat one. As she knew he had noticed her hesitation, she knew he had felt the coldness she had shown him, but he hadn't reacted, he hadn't raised his voice, or even given her a hard look. He had simply smiled and accepted her dismissive behavior with unsettling calm. Joanne's eyes kept flickering toward him as she moved up and down the aisles, the way his face remained impassive, the way his gaze never seemed to leave the window, even though she could feel his presence in the room like a quiet storm waiting to break the air around him, seemed to hum with an energy that she couldn't quite put her finger on. When the drink cart came around again, she made her way toward first class, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her shoulders as she glanced at Keanu. Once more this time their eyes met for a split second. His gaze wasn't cold or angry. It was almost too understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking, but didn't want to make it awkward still. There was something about that moment, something about the way he was watching her, that made her heart race. She forced herself to look away and focus on the other passengers, but she could still feel his eyes on her, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The feeling only grew stronger as the minutes passed, and she began to wonder if she had made a huge mistake, if she had somehow insulted him in a way that would cost her more than just an awkward encounter on a flight. The rest of the flight passed in a blur for Joanne. She tried to ignore the nagging feeling in her stomach, but it kept creeping up on her. Every time she glanced at Keanu, every time she saw his stillness, it felt like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to acknowledge what had happened between them, and the thought made her skin crawl. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the unease in the cabin was palpable. The crew had fallen into their routines. The hum of the plane and the low chatter of passengers provided the soundtrack to the journey, but there was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. Joanne had served the last of her drinks and was now headed to the back of the plane when she noticed the captain speak briefly with one of the other flight attendants. He looked serious, and for the first time since the flight had started, Joanne felt a ripple of concern cross her mind. Something wasn't right. A few moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone steady, but somehow off. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some minor turbulence and will be experiencing some delays for the next few minutes. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The announcement seemed routine enough, but as Joanne moved toward the back of the plane, she noticed a shift in the air. Something had changed. She could feel it deep in her gut. The atmosphere had gone from calm to charged in an instant. Passengers were looking around more than usual. A few were whispering, and the low murmur of conversation had escalated into a quiet buzz. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to her like a shadow every time she looked at the first-class cabin. She could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the turbulence, it was something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the plane's altitude. As Joanne reached the rear galley, she spotted one of the senior flight attendants, who gave her a quick nod, but there was something different about the way the woman was looking at her, something in her eyes that made Joanne uneasy. Was it pity, or something more difficult to read? She wasn't sure. But before she could ask what was going on, the senior attendant spoke quietly. "Joanne, you need to go back to first class." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her breath caught in her chest. She turned and began to walk back to the front of the plane, but her heart was pounding now. What was happening? Why had the senior attendant sent her back to Keanu's section? Why was this moment becoming more and more uncomfortable with every passing second? Joanne's feet seemed to move of their own accord as she walked back toward the first-class section. Her heart was hammering in her chest. She couldn't understand why everything felt so wrong. All of a sudden, the noise of the cabin had quieted. The usual hum of the engines now felt distant, as if it were coming from a place she couldn't quite reach. She tried to steady her breathing, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't loosen no matter how hard she tried. As she approached the first-class cabin, she saw Keanu sitting calmly in his seat, his eyes still focused on the window, as if nothing had happened, as if the tension between them wasn't hanging heavy in the air. Joanne forced herself to smile, trying to appear as casual as possible. But she knew her efforts were in vain. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Keanu glanced at her for a brief second, his expression unchanged, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something almost too knowing, as though he had already seen through her facade. Joanne opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She felt embarrassed, not just because of the way she had dismissed him earlier, but because it seemed like something was about to happen, and she wasn't ready for it. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Then Keanu spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Is everything all right?" He asked. The words were simple, but there was an undercurrent of something more in his tone, something that made Joanne's pulse quicken. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain herself, to apologize for her behavior. But she couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. She was too caught up in the feeling that something had shifted in the very air around them, something that had been set in motion. The moment she had dismissed him earlier, she felt her throat tighten as the realization hit her like a wave crashing over her. Keanu watched her closely, his gaze unwavering, and for a moment Joanne felt like she was being scrutinized in a way that made her feel exposed. The people around them had started to notice the strange energy between the two of them. The whispers had begun again, soft murmurs from the other passengers, as they exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what was going on. Joanne knew she had to act, she had to do something. But what could she do? How could she fix this mistake? How could she undo the damage she had done by treating him with such cold indifference? Keanu was no ordinary passenger, she knew that much, and she had made a critical error. Before she could speak, the senior flight attendant appeared beside her and gave her a look that made her heart sink. "Joanne," the woman said quietly but firmly, "come with me now." The words weren't a request, they were an order, and Joanne knew that this wasn't a conversation she wanted to have in front of the passengers. She nodded quickly and turned to follow the senior attendant back toward the galley. As they walked down the narrow aisle, Joanne felt the eyes of the passengers on her, their gazes heavy with curiosity. Some of them were still whispering, but there was an undertone of unease in their voices, as though they knew something was wrong, as though they could sense that something far more serious was unfolding beneath the surface. Once they reached the galley, the senior attendant turned to Joanne, her expression serious, but not unkind. "You need to be aware of something," she said in a low voice. "Keanu Reeves just made a call to the airline headquarters." Joanne's stomach dropped at the mention of his name, but she didn't interrupt. "He's not angry, but he's made it clear that he feels your behavior was unprofessional and unacceptable." The words stung more than Joanne had expected, but she knew there was no denying the truth. "Do you realize what this means?" The senior attendant continued, her tone sharp. "Keanu's influence goes far beyond this plane. If he decides to take this further, it could cost you your job. Do you understand that?" Joanne nodded slowly, her mind racing as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. She had never imagined that a simple moment of carelessness could lead to something like this. The senior attendant gave her one last look before turning and walking away, leaving Joanne standing alone in the galley, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she tried to process what had just been said. Everything seemed to be spinning out of control. She had underestimated Keanu. She had underestimated the consequences of her actions. And now she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. Joanne stood there for what felt like an eternity, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and regret. She had made a mistake, a big one, and she wasn't sure if she could fix it now, or if it was already too late. Joanne could feel her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the galley counter. Her mind was racing at a speed she couldn't control. The senior flight attendant's words echoed in her ears. Keanu had made a call to the airline headquarters, and now everything seemed to be spinning out of control. She had no idea what kind of power he had over the airline, but she knew it wasn't good. This wasn't just about a small mistake anymore. This was something bigger than she could have imagined. She glanced down the aisle toward the first-class cabin. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but now there was something more than just nervousness. It was fear, the kind of fear that crept up your spine and tightened your chest with every passing second. She had been working as a flight attendant for over 15 years, and never once had she felt like this. Never once had she made a mistake that could cost her everything. She walked slowly down the narrow hallway, trying to steady her breathing, but it was no use. Every step she took felt like it was carrying her closer to an inevitable outcome. She couldn't escape. The weight of the moment was suffocating, and it only grew heavier as she reached the first-class section again. Keanu was still sitting there in his seat, his gaze fixed out the window, as though he had forgotten the world around him. His calmness only added to the tension. Joanne couldn't figure him out. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset. He was just quiet, and that quietness seemed to be a force of its own, something that filled the cabin and made everything feel even more intense than it already was. Joanne stood at the entrance to first class, unsure of what to do next. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, as if they knew that something was wrong. She could feel the murmurs rise again as the atmosphere shifted. This time, it wasn't just curiosity, it was concern, it was fear. And for the first time in a long while, Joanne realized that this wasn't a situation she could just brush off. She took a deep breath and stepped into the first-class cabin. Her mind was still spinning, but she knew she had to face Keanu. Now she couldn't avoid this moment any longer. She had to fix what she had broken, even if she didn't know how to do it. As she approached his seat, she noticed the faintest hint of a smile on his face. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, and somehow that smile only made everything worse, because it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It wasn't a smile that said everything was going to be okay. It was a smile that made Joanne feel like she was being examined under a microscope, like he knew something she didn't. She cleared her throat before speaking, her voice sounding shakier than she wanted it to. Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. I didn't mean to be rude or dismissive. I've been working under a lot of stress, and Keanu raised a hand to stop her mid-sentence, his expression still calm, but his eyes sharp and calculating. It's okay, he said, his voice soft but firm. I understand. I've been on enough flights to know how things can get tense sometimes. He leaned back in his seat slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. But you should know that how you treat people matters, especially when they're in your care. His words were simple, but they hit her harder than any angry outburst could have. Joanne swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. But it was difficult. She felt exposed under his gaze, like he was seeing through her facade to the core of her insecurities and fears. His calmness was unnerving. It was like he had already forgiven her without needing her to explain herself, and that only made her feel worse. I'm truly sorry, Joanne whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if she was apologizing for her actions earlier, or for the fact that she had underestimated him. She had assumed that he was just another celebrity, a man who would shrug off a small mistake. But now she realized just how wrong she had been. Keanu's gaze softened slightly, but there was no warmth in it, just a quiet understanding that made Joanne feel even smaller. You're lucky. I'm not the kind of person who holds grudges, he said finally, his tone neutral. But there was something else there, something that made her wonder just how much power he truly had in this situation. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as the silence hung in the air between them. But then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, Keanu looked away, his eyes shifting back to the window, as though the conversation had ended just like that, without another word from him. Joanne stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next, her mind still racing, her emotions a whirlwind of regret and confusion. She didn't know what had just happened. Had he truly forgiven her? Or was this all just part of some larger game? She wasn't aware if she wanted to ask him more questions to understand why he wasn't angry, why he wasn't making a scene, but she didn't dare push him any further. As she turned to walk back to the galley, her mind kept racing with the same question. Why had he reacted this way? Why hadn't he made a scene? Why hadn't he demanded something from her? Why was he so calm and so controlled? Was it all part of his plan, or was it just a matter of principle? But before she could answer her own questions, the captain's voice echoed through the cabin once again, his tone much more serious this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a situation that requires immediate attention. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." The words sent a shockwave of tension through the cabin, and Joanne's heart skipped a beat. What was happening now? What had just changed in the air? Was it possible that Keanu had already set something into motion? Was it too late for her to fix her mistake after all? Joanne felt her body go cold as the captain's announcement echoed through the cabin, the words hanging in the air. Like a dark cloud, passengers shifted in their seats. Murmurs rose like waves crashing against the walls of the plane. But it wasn't just the announcement that made the tension rise, it was the heavy silence that followed. Keanu had turned slightly in his seat, his eyes still fixed out the window. But there was something in the way he sat now, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She tried to keep her composure, but it was becoming harder by the second. She knew the situation was escalating, but she didn't know how or why, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. She had to understand what was happening. She had to figure out if she had somehow crossed a line that she couldn't uncross. Joanne turned slowly and moved back down the aisle. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with unease. Every passenger was looking around. Some were trying to peek at the flight attendants to gauge their reactions, but no one seemed to know what was going on. Not even the crew seemed to have answers, and that only made the uncertainty worse. As she walked toward the galley, she caught the senior attendant's eye. The woman was standing by the service station, her arms crossed, as she watched the situation unfold, her face unreadable. But there was a flicker of something there, something that made Joanne's pulse quicken. When the senior attendant saw her approach, she gave a small nod and gestured toward the back of the plane. Joanne didn't hesitate. She moved quickly past the other flight attendants and reached the back galley, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. When she entered the small galley, the senior attendant was already there waiting for her, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Joanne, we need to talk." The words were quiet but firm. Joanne nodded, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her stomach twisted in knots as the senior attendant motioned for her to sit down at the small folding seat against the wall. "We've been contacted by the airline's corporate office." The senior attendant began, her tone serious. "Keanu Reeves has made a formal complaint about you." The words struck Joanne like a slap in the face. She had expected something bad, but this was worse than she could have imagined. "But he didn't seem angry," Joanne said, her voice trembling. "He was calm. He didn't even raise his voice. I thought maybe he'd just let it go." The senior attendant shook her head slowly. "Keanu's not angry. He doesn't work that way. But he has a reputation for holding people accountable, and right now your actions have caused a ripple effect far beyond this plane." She paused, her gaze piercing, as if weighing her next words carefully. "He's requested that a full report be filed about the way you handled things, and unless the airline addresses it properly, we may be looking at a serious investigation." Joanne's chest tightened as the words sunk in. The reality of the situation was finally hitting her. She had no idea the extent of Keanu's influence over the airline, or how seriously they took his opinion. She had been so focused on the immediate tension in the cabin that she hadn't realized how deeply her mistake could affect everything. "What happens now?" Joanne whispered, her voice barely audible. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her as the senior attendant stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Right now, we have to wait. The airline is going to review everything. But if they find that you violated their standards, they could take disciplinary action." She paused for a moment, as if she were considering something before speaking again. "This could cost you your job, Joanne, and possibly your career." The words hung in the air like a guillotine poised to drop, and Joanne could barely breathe. The fear she had felt earlier now settled deep in her chest, making her hands shake with the weight of what she had done. She had never imagined a single mistake could lead to something this massive, something this uncontrollable. She'd have been wrong about Keanu. She had underestimated him in every possible way. His calm demeanor had fooled her into thinking she could get away with her careless behavior. But now she understood just how serious things had become. As she sat there in the galley, the silence around her seemed deafening, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She didn't know what to do next. She didn't know how to fix this. How could she make up for the mistake she had made when the consequences were so far beyond anything she had ever expected? The senior attendant gave her a final look before turning away. "You need to stay calm," she said, her tone more gentle now, but still firm. "There's nothing more you can do right now. But wait, you've already apologized to him. And there's nothing else to say." With that, she walked away, leaving Joanne alone in the galley. Joanne sat still, staring at the empty space in front of her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Her mind was spinning with all the things she should have done differently, all the things she should have said to Keanu instead of brushing him off like he was just another passenger. As she sat there in the silence, the plane seemed to shift beneath her. The low rumble of the engines, now louder than before, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than ever, and all Joanne could do was wait for whatever came next, not knowing if the worst was already behind her or if it was still waiting just around the corner. Joanne's mind spun in circles as she sat in the galley, her hands still shaking from the conversation with the senior attendant. She had no idea how she had let things spiral so far out of control. One simple mistake had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And now she was trapped in it. There was no way out, no way to undo what had been done, no way to erase the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. She tried to calm her breathing, but it was no use. The weight of the situation was crushing her with every passing second. She could still hear the captain's announcement replaying in her mind, and now the thought of Keanu sitting up there in first class just made her stomach churn. He was a celebrity, but beyond that, he was someone with power, someone whose influence reached far beyond anything Joanne had ever imagined. The minutes dragged on like hours, and every second felt like it was adding another layer of pressure to her already fragile mind. She had always prided herself on being a professional, but now it seemed like all that professionalism had crumbled in an instant. How had she let herself be so careless? How had she not seen the danger in brushing off a man like him? Just then the cabin door opened, and the senior attendant walked in her face. As serious as ever, she looked at Joanne for a moment before speaking, her voice low and steady. "The airline has made a decision," she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "They want you to go speak with the captain immediately." Joanne's heart dropped to her stomach, her eyes widened in shock. She had been expecting some kind of reprimand, but she hadn't been prepared for this, not for a meeting with the captain, not for a face-to-face confrontation that would seal her fate one way or another. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The decision's been made," the senior attendant said, her tone unchanged. "Keanu's complaint has triggered an investigation, and the airline's response is immediate. You need to speak with the captain and explain yourself. He'll decide what happens next." Joanne nodded slowly, but inside she was panicking. Her heart was racing faster than it ever had before. What had she done? What was going to happen to her? Now was her career really on the line? Because of one careless moment of dismissal, she felt like she was sinking deeper into a hole with no way to climb out. The senior attendant gave her one last look, and then left her standing there alone in the galley. For a moment Joanne just stood frozen, her mind swirling with dread and uncertainty. She had no idea what to expect when she entered the cockpit. She only knew that the consequences of her actions were about to become a lot more real. Taking a deep breath, Joanne forced herself to move. Her legs felt heavy as she walked down the narrow aisle toward the front of the plane. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown. She could hear the murmurs of the passengers around her, but their voices seemed distant, as if they were coming from a world she no longer belonged to. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a woman on the edge of everything she had worked for her entire career. When she reached the cockpit door, the senior attendant was already standing there waiting for her. She didn't say anything, just motioned for Joanne to step inside. Joanne took one last shaky breath before entering the small, cramped space where the captain sat in the pilot's seat. His face was expressionless, but there was something in his eyes that made Joanne's stomach twist. He didn't say anything immediately. He just studied her, like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. After a long moment of silence, the captain spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Joanne, we've received a formal complaint from a very high-profile passenger." His words were clipped like a warning, and Joanne's throat tightened as he continued, "Keanu Reeves has raised concerns about your behavior during this flight, and the airline is taking this very seriously." Joanne swallowed hard. She wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out. She just stood there, frozen in place, as the captain went on. "I've been instructed to assess the situation and make a decision based on your response." The captain said, his tone not unkind but distant. "Tell me what happened from your perspective." Joanne's mind raced. She had no idea where to begin. How could she explain herself when she wasn't even sure what had gone wrong? She couldn't believe this was happening to her. She had been doing her job for so long without incident, and now here she was standing in front of the captain of the plane, about to face consequences that could ruin her career. "Sir," she finally managed to speak, her voice trembling, I didn't mean to be rude. I didn't mean to offend Mr. Reeves." She paused, trying to find the right words. "I was just stressed out, and I didn't handle the situation well. I regret it now, but I never imagined it would escalate like this." The captain nodded slowly, as if weighing her words, but there was no sympathy in his expression, no indication of what he was thinking. "Stress is something we all deal with," he said. "But when you're in this job, you have to leave that stress behind when you step onto the plane. Your priority is the passengers, every one of them, regardless of who they are." Joanne nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had let her stress cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price for it. The captain looked at her for a moment longer before speaking again. "I'm going to submit my report to corporate, but understand this: your actions have consequences. How the airline handles this will depend on how seriously they view your response right now." His voice was calm, but his words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Joanne felt her world closing in on her. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she knew this conversation would be the turning point, the moment when everything she had worked for either crumbled or was salvaged. Joanne's breath caught in her throat as the captain's words settled over her like a blanket of cold reality. She had hoped for some kind of reprieve, some sign that things could still be salvaged, but the captain's demeanor didn't suggest that things were looking up. Instead, his steady gaze bore down on her, and every word he spoke felt like a nail in her coffin. He was telling her that everything she had worked for was at risk, and that it was all hanging on the edge of the decision the airline would make next. As she stood there in the cockpit with the door closed behind her, she couldn't help but feel like a small cog in a much larger machine, a machine that didn't care about her stress, her intentions, or her apologies. All it cared about was the bottom line and the image of the airline, and she was nothing more than a pawn in that game. The captain didn't speak for a moment, just sat there, staring at her, waiting for a response. and Joanne felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her chest. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She was terrified of what was happening, terrified of what might happen to her career if things went wrong, and all she could do was stand there in silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the captain leaned back in his chair, his eyes softening slightly, but there was still no warmth in his gaze, only a quiet professionalism. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "but you need to understand that you are not just representing yourself. When you step onto this plane, you are representing the airline. You are the face that passengers see every day. You are the ones they depend on to make their flight experience as smooth as possible." Joan nodded slowly. She understood that more than anything she had been taught that from the very beginning of her career. But now as she saw the full weight of those words staring her in the face, this wasn't just about a small mistake. This was about a failure to uphold the airline's standards. And in an industry where perfection was the expectation, even the smallest slip-up could have far-reaching consequences. She wanted to apologize again, but she held back. She had already done that enough. What she needed now was a way out, a way to fix things, a way to prove that she was still worthy of the job she loved. The captain looked at her once more, his eyes piercing, as though he could see right through her. "I'm not the one making the final decision here," he said quietly, "but I will be making my recommendation. And if you think I'm going to recommend keeping you on the team, after what happened, you'd better start proving to me that you've learned something from this experience." His tone was firm, but fair, and Joanne knew he wasn't giving her an easy out. He was challenging her to step up to the plate and show that she was more than just a mistake waiting to happen. Her pulse quickened as she realized what he was asking of her. This wasn't just about saving face. This was about redemption. This was about proving to herself and to the airline that she could handle the pressure and the responsibility that came with the job. And right now, she didn't know if she was ready for that, but she had no choice but to try. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, trying to push back the rising wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing in her chest. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can do better." Her words felt hollow to her own ears, but she knew they were the only things she could say in that moment. The captain gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but didn't say anything else for a long time, and Joanne stood there waiting for some kind of sign, some kind of guidance on what to do next. But instead, all she got was silence, the kind of silence that made her feel even more exposed than before. She could feel the weight of the captain's gaze on her, but it didn't provide any comfort. It only made her more aware of how fragile her situation was. After what felt like an eternity, the captain finally stood up and motioned for her to follow him. He opened the cockpit door, and she followed him down the narrow hallway toward the front of the plane, her stomach twisted into knots with each step she took. When they reached the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted once again. The energy in the air was different now. There was an undercurrent of tension in the cabin, like everyone knew that something was about to happen, and that something had the potential to change everything. Keanu was still sitting in his seat, his eyes closed as though he were resting, but there was a quiet intensity about him now that hadn't been there before. His calm demeanor had returned, but there was a subtle difference to it. This time he wasn't just calm, he was calculating, like he was watching everything unfold with a level of awareness that made Joanne feel even more insignificant than she already did. The captain stopped in the aisle just a few feet from Keanu's seat and turned to face Joanne, his voice low and controlled. "This is your moment," he said simply. "You need to go up to him and show him that you're taking responsibility for what happened. Show him that you understand the gravity of the situation and that you're committed to doing better." Joanne felt her legs tremble beneath her, but she knew there was no turning back now. She couldn't avoid this any longer. She had to face Keanu. She had to prove herself to him, somehow, even though she wasn't sure how to do it. With her heart pounding in her chest, she took a step forward and moved toward Keanu's seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. She wasn't just facing the consequences of her actions. She was facing the man who held the key to her future, and everything she had worked for was hanging in the balance. When she reached his seat, Keanu opened his eyes and looked up at her, his gaze steady and piercing. And for a moment Joanne could barely breathe. The weight of his stare made her feel small and insignificant, like she was standing in front of a giant. She had no idea how to begin, but she knew she had to try. Joanne stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart racing, as she locked eyes with Keanu Reeves for the first time since the incident. She could feel her palms starting to sweat, and the weight of the entire situation pressing down on her chest. Like an anvil, she had no idea what to say or how to say it, but she knew that this moment would define everything for her career, her future, her reputation. All of it was on the line, and somehow she had to make him see that she was more than just a flight attendant who had made a mistake. She had to make him believe that she understood the gravity of what had happened. Keanu sat there, still as ever, his calm gaze fixed on her. But this time there was something different about him. It wasn't the cold, detached stare of a celebrity. It was something more piercing, something that made her feel like he could see right through her, like he was weighing every decision she had ever made in her life and finding her wanting. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she struggled to find her voice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "Mr. Reeves, I just want to say I'm deeply sorry for what happened earlier. I know I didn't handle things the way I should have, and I understand the impact it had on you and everyone else on this flight. I regret my actions, and I promise you that I'll learn from this. I can't undo what I did, but I can do better going forward." She finished, her words hanging in the air, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for his response. For a moment, Keanu didn't say anything. He just stared at her, as though considering her words, weighing them against some unseen measure. And Joanne could feel every second drag on like a heavy weight, each one making her feel smaller, more insignificant, and more desperate for him to say something, anything that would give her some kind of clue as to what he was thinking. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he spoke, his voice low and steady, but there was a certain warmth in it that she hadn't expected. "I appreciate your apology," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But it's not about the apology anymore. It's about what comes next, how you handle the aftermath, how you use this experience to become better than you were before." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in, before continuing. "I've seen a lot of people who make mistakes in this industry, a lot of people who let the pressure get to them and break down. But the ones who succeed, the ones who rise above, are the ones who don't run from their mistakes. They face them head on, and they grow from them." Joanne nodded slowly, her mind racing with his words. They were simple but powerful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had been so focused on the consequences that she had forgotten about the possibility of redemption. She had thought she was beyond saving. But maybe Keanu was right. Maybe this wasn't the end of her career, but the beginning of something new, something better. Keanu's gaze softened slightly as he continued speaking. "It's not about how you mess up. It's about how you make things right, how you prove to everyone, including yourself, that you can do better." He paused again, his eyes searching hers. "And I think you have it in you to be better than this moment." Joanne felt something shift inside her. She had been so caught up in the fear of losing everything that she had forgotten to focus on the possibility of growth, the chance to prove herself, not just to Keanu or the airline, but to herself. She wasn't defined by this one mistake. She wasn't defined by the fear that had paralyzed her for so long. She was defined by what she did next, by how she chose to move forward. Keanu stood up slowly, and as he did, so he gave her a small but genuine smile, one that spoke volumes more than any words could. "You've got this," he said simply before turning and walking away, leaving Joanne standing there with the weight of his words echoing in her mind. As she watched him disappear into the distance, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who had faced the consequences of her actions and come out the other side stronger. She wasn't perfect, but she was determined to do better, to rise above the fear and doubt that had held her back. The captain, who had been watching the entire exchange from a distance, stepped forward and gave her a nod of approval. "Well done." He said, his tone quieter than before, but there was no mistaking the respect in his voice. "You've got the right mindset, and that's what matters." Joanne nodded silently. As she turned to walk back down the aisle, the weight on her shoulders had lightened just a little, but there was still a long way to go. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid of it. She knew she would make mistakes along the way, but now she understood that it wasn't the mistakes that mattered, it was how she learned from them, how she kept moving forward. As the flight continued and the final leg of the journey began, Joanne felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just doing her job, she was living up to the responsibility that came with it. She was ready for whatever came next, ready to prove to herself that she was more than just a flight attendant who had made a mistake. She was a professional, someone who would rise above any challenge. And as the plane began its descent toward its final destination, Joanne couldn't help but smile to herself, knowing that no matter what happened next, she had already won the most important victory of all, the victory over her own fears.